The story I'm going to tell is about my 21 years of living in Southeast Asia, because they are the most unusual part of my life. The rest of my life was pretty routine for my day and age. But to begin, there is a little background history that you should know, and how it happened that I was living in Southeast Asia. My husband was Harry Strick, and his parents were raised in Holland, Michigan, of Dutch descent. It was a time when in Holland, Michigan, Dutch was still widely spoken. When my father-in-law, Harry's father, was an adult, he became a physician. And in 1911, with his new bride, he traveled to China. And they lived in a small island called Kulangsu, which was off the coast of China in a province called Fujian. It was there that your grandfather or great-grandfather was born. And it was there that Dr. Strick built a hospital, and he became quite renowned in that part of China as a very good and sympathetic and understanding doctor.
What was his first name?
Edward.
Thank you.
Yeah. When Harry was, I would say 8 or 9 or 10 years old, he was sent off to school in Shanghai. So he went to the Shanghai American School for 2 or 3 years. Before that, he had been homeschooled. In 1936, the family came back to the United States because the Japanese had invaded China. War was raging, and it was no longer a safe country for foreigners to live in. My family was completely different. My mother and father were raised at opposite ends of the continent. My mother grew up in Grand Haven, Michigan.
Excuse me? What is your mother's name?
My mother's name was Miriam Witt. Miriam, a good biblical name. She hated it. And she was valedictorian of the class of 1895. No, she was born in 1895, so if she was valedictorian of her high school class, and that would have been 16 years later. And she went to Vassar for 2 years, and then she left Vassar and went to the Conservatory of Music in Cincinnati, from which she received a degree in piano performance, probably. She was a very fine pianist. My father, on the other hand, grew up in Mountain View, California, the youngest of 7 children. His father, my grandfather, was Benjamin Bubb, B-U-B-B, Bubb. And Benjamin and his family had crossed the Great Plains in 1850. Benjamin, being 12 years old at the time, in a covered wagon train. Benjamin had walked beside the covered wagon, driving the cattle, while his mother and 2 sisters rode in the wagon. Part of the country took the northerly route to Oregon, and part of the country pushed on over the Rockies to California, where they settled briefly in Sacramento, and then they settled in Mountain View, and they homesteaded. They received the plot of land, I think it was 120 acres, from the government, which my grandfather ultimately expanded to 300 acres. And then my grandmother came across the prairie by one of the very first trains that was running. This was after the Trans-Pacific Railroad had been completed in 1865. Her name was Sarah Smith, and she was 17 years old. She married my grandfather Benjamin, who was then 34. They had 7 children, and my father was the youngest. He was John. He was the only one of the family who went to college, and he went to Stanford. He was the class of 1908. He had a degree in engineering. During World War I, he was a captain in the Army, and he met my mother during the war, brought her to California, where after several moves, they eventually settled in Palo Alto. And I had been born in Berkeley, California in 1925. And my sister, Sally, had been born in Sacramento, California in 1922. So that is roughly the history of the family, except when Harry and I met in Carmel, California in 1945, he was a sergeant in the Army, and this is World War II, and he was finishing out the war at a Fort Ord, which was in Monterey, California, and we met by chance in Carmel because my mother was giving a piano recital at that time in somebody's house, and Harry had been invited because he loved music and was very interested in it, and that's where we met. We dated a few times. Very quickly after the war, he was demobilized, and he went down to Los Angeles, where he interviewed with a company called General Petroleum and was offered a job with Standard Vacuum Oil Company. That was a company owned jointly by Standard Oil New Jersey and Saucony Mobiles. Saucony, I've forgotten their name. Anyway, it was understood that Harry was going to work overseas, which obviously fitted him very well because he had been born in Asia. And we certainly thought that with his background in Chinese, that he would be sent to China to work. But that was not to be. He was instead sent to Southeast Asia, and specifically to Java, which was then part of the Netherlands East Indies. Stop.